Welcome to the Taming Lightning podcast. I'm Percy Eccles II, and the idea behind these conversations is to expand our knowledge of plasma and traditional neon, looking beyond associations with novelty and sign making, and to explore the potential of rare or noble gases by learning from those who use them. We'll be talking with artists, makers, and researchers, each offering their unique knowledge and experience regarding their use in art, science, and history. The intro is Boost by Joachim Karud. It was selected by your votes and participation in the intro music poll for Taming Lightning. Joachim is a Swedish artist that loves to produce chill and happy music and does so for copyright-free use. Be sure to support his music by crediting him in the use, subscribing, and/or by donation. If you like what you hear, you can find him on Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, SoundCloud, and Spotify. As a side note, I've been working with a local Pittsburgh artist, Q2K, who you can find on SoundCloud, and producing some original music for Taming Lightning. We share many ideologies when it comes to art and community. He's seen the work since its conception and has a unique eye, or should I say ear, for representing the visual as sound. So he can take all the visual light and the touch and the way that the energy inside of the glass vessels move and turn that into music and turn that into sound and bring that stuff together. So I'm really excited about our collaboration, and I hope you will too when it comes out. In today's podcast, we'll be talking with Pat Collentine about the differences between traditional neon and plasma as it relates to both art and lighting. Unfortunately, due to software issues, we were not able to record the entire conversation, but today's topic will be covered in full. And I've added a little something at the end for you, so stay tuned. Pat Collentine is a glassblower and sign maker of Tesla Neon Studios in Chico, California, as well as an artist and educator experimenting in plasma neon. We met back in 2014 at Pilchuck Glass School, where I took his class called Interactive Light. It was my first introduction into what plasma is, and it spurred my interest in neon as well as doing that myself. In that process, we've had many discussions, and he's been a great friend and mentor.
Pat, take us away here. Tell us about yourself.
Well, good morning, Percy. It's nice to talk to you about neon and plasma, two of my favorite subjects. And so you took my course at Interactive Light at Pilchuck, and I began with neon probably, I'm trying to think, 1983 was my first year starting to work with neon. And I did the old method where you apprenticed with a local neon sign shop. And at that time, I was enrolled as an art student here at Chico State and was already blowing glass. So I had started to already accumulate some offhand glass blowing experience. And I knew that I had an interest in working with neon from just having traveled around and looked at neon. And I actually first began working in glass as an apprentice in Germany, working with scientific instruments. So when I saw that neon was working with tubing, it seemed like a natural to adapt into neon beyond just working with hot glass. I was so interested in hot glass, and at that time, very few people were working in neon. So I thought, that would be fun to be able to add to my hot glass experience with working with neon. So I started out working as a traditional neon apprentice at a local sign shop. And from that, I actually was able to work with my master that taught me how to do neon and set up a second shop here in town that literally became the shop that I started to work at. And that was really how I began in neon. But really, very much neon had a tradition of working out of people's small garages and workshops. It was often the trade that was taught to the son of the sign owner. When I used to go meet people, they'd ask me, did your father own the sign company? I said, no, I'm just an artist that wanted to work in neon. So that's really where I got my background in neon. And I continued when I graduated from school to work with the local sign shop and do what I would define now as traditional neon. And in that time in that time in the early 80s, there was only traditional neon. There are a few early innovators in what we're going to later define as plasma neon, and one of them name was Bill Parker, and he had some early works in the San Francisco Exploratorium that had to do with plasma neon. But mostly at that time, it was really more about working with exotic gases. In the early days of plasma neon, it was less what we now think of plasma neon, more about working with some of the exotic gases and giving people an opportunity to see these exotic gases in large enclosures. You know, in this case, Bill Parker used to work in tubes that were probably 100 millimeters in diameter by 4 feet long. So you could really see large volumes. And of course, in that time, he was experimenting with xenon gas and some of the effects that you can get from xenon gas. So I was aware that there was something beyond traditional neon, but at that time, very few people were exploring that. Down in Los Angeles, the artist Larry Albright was one of those people working that way. And so that at that time, there was only what we now refer to as traditional neon.
Right.
And I guess one of the questions you had was about what's the difference between traditional neon and what we're now kind of defining as plasma neon.
Yeah, that would be our kind of main topic for today, is about the difference between those two processes and where they kind of fit today.
Yeah, I've been trying to contextualize those differences, and I think that one of the things that differentiates them is the processing of the object. When I say the processing, obviously what we want to do is we want to create a vacuum, and then we want to backfill that vacuum with some sort of inert gas. And so then the other thing is that's probably very different from them is how we actually illuminate the object as well. So let me start with the processing. I don't know how much I want to go over traditional neon processing, but to describe traditional neon, we're talking about working primarily as a advertising medium. A lot of people forget that traditional neon is really an advertising medium that you see in the storefronts. Of course, it's used as an art form, but it's traditionally used as an advertising medium. So the interest in it being an advertising medium is to be as bright as possible. That's really what neon was all about, is trying to be as bright as possible. So all of the things that were associated with neon was really about to increase its visibility, increase its brightness. And one of the ways that you do that is you take different phosphor powders and you coat the interior of clear glass tubes, and that will enhance the brightness of the tube. So now we're talking about a clear glass tube with electrodes at either end. And when we talk about electrodes, those are just metal shells that then have a metal seal that goes through the tube that will isolate this interior tube from the exterior. And one of the things that you'd have is one of these electrodes often has a tubulation. And this is just a small tube that comes off either the back of an electrode, or back when I first started in neon, we would buy just electrodes that had no tubulation, and then I'd blow a little tube off the side of the tube. And we're talking about traditional neon often works from 8 millimeters is very small diameter tube to 15 or as large as 18 millimeters. This is kind of that range we call traditional neon. People get often a little confused. There's a part of traditional neon that's called cold cathode, and that's a larger diameter tube. It's used primarily for border tube illumination in architecture. And the rule of thumb is that if you have a larger diameter tube, you need to have a more perfect vacuum. And so to do the larger diameter cold cathode tubes takes a slightly more sophisticated vacuum pump system than traditional neon. So most neon people don't work with tubing any larger than 15 millimeters because they often work with a vacuum system that's a little more simplistic than what I would call a cold cathode vacuum system. The larger your tube, the more efficient your vacuum system has to be when you're using 2 electrodes.
Mm-hmm.
And because you're really trying to make a fancy light bulb, and you want to remove as many of the impurities that would be inside of that tube as possible. And strangely enough, these larger tubes have lots more places for these impurities to hide.
Right. And so for our audience here who, I've had to show them a picture of the electrode, I guess one simplistic idea of kind of to visualize this before I actually show this on the post or anything is, or they can look it up on their own, is looking at, fluorescent bulbs. Those 2 metal caps are essentially electrodes. Is that correct?
That is correct, yeah. A fluorescent bulb would be a version of cold cathode, a larger diameter cold cathode tube.
Mm-hmm.
And it's a little tricky with fluorescent bulbs because the way that they are powered is slightly different, but that's the general idea. That
mm-hmm.
is a form of neon. And again, when we use the term neon, it's like the term plasma neon. We've done this really just to help define areas of interest. Traditional neon, it's this cold cathode form, and it has 2 electrodes, and it uses tubing in both electrodes at each end, and the flow of electrons is from electrode to electrode, which
mm-hmm.
really is the most efficient way to make a bright tube is with 2 electrodes, so that you can put a lot of energy into that tube, and then the electrodes will stream very efficiently from one electrode to the other, or I should say, the electrons will be stimulated through from one electrode to the other, and that's what you see is you put this energy in, and the free ions then illuminate the colors that we traditionally associate with neon,
mm-hmm.
which would be blue and red. In traditional neon, you can use more exotic gases, but normally you work with only neon and argon with a small amount of mercury is mixed in with the argon to give you what we call neon blue and neon red.
Right.
And all of the colors are through combinations of phosphors and colored glass tubing and that sort of thing, and that makes for a very bright tube.
So in regards to traditional neon, does it require mercury for the use of argon?
It does, sense of brightness. If you
Okay.
illuminate an object with just argon gas, you'll actually see that it's quite a dull blue. And a lot of times I'll show people where I'll have the mercury inside of the tubulation, because when you process the tube, it goes through a process of heating the electrodes and heating the tube to 450 degrees in order to sterilize and get the charge the electrodes and also vacuum to evacuate a tube. It's a tricky process to evacuate a tube. So it really helps when you heat up a tube and stir up all of those electrons and molecules that they're easier to suck out then. You can imagine they're inside of a tube and they're moving around, and it's easier to suck out an object that is moving around and active than it is one that's clinging to the interior walls. That's a place for impurities to hide and that sort of thing. So when you apply heat, in the case of traditional neon, we do that with high voltage. We actually apply an enormous amount of high voltage, and that actually heats up the tube because the tube is at that time, by controlling the vacuum, is a very inefficient conductor of electricity, and that by process heats up the tube. I know it's a little confusing if you're not familiar with the neon process, but you really need to get that tube very sterile on the interior, and the electrodes themselves need to be very sterile in order to get a really nice, clean illumination.
Mm-hmm.
And so the process of doing neon, it's a little tricky. A lot of people struggle with the processing of neon because if you don't get it exactly right, you'll have contaminants in your tube, and your tube will illuminate, and it'll run very hot, as we say, or sometimes it can run slightly off color if it's not properly processed, and that's about controlling the vacuum and how you fill it and how you charge the electrodes with heat. So with traditional neon, it can be trickier than people are aware of to make a tube burn, as we refer to, really bright and clean.
Mm-hmm.
And when I talk about traditional neon and creating a vacuum, we often use what we call a mechanical vacuum pump, and that's a pump that's filled with oil, and by the turning of that pump, it actually will draw out the air out of the tube itself. Because in order to backfill these tubes with these inert gases, we want a really empty environment to put the gas into. So the more efficiently that we can take that air out of the tube, the pure environment we can now place our gases into. And so with traditional neon, that's part of this evacuating and using high voltage electricity to create this really hot and pure environment that once it cools down, we then gently backfill with these inert gases that will then illuminate. In this case, just argon and neon. And of course, the argon has just a little small ball of mercury inside of it. And actually, fluorescent tubes do as well. People often aren't aware that that's why you need to dispose of fluorescent tubes at a proper location, because there's a small ball of mercury inside of every fluorescent tube as well. Or all these small little tubes that people use for light bulbs that have the spirals, those also have mercury in them. They're called compact fluorescent tubes. So that's sort of the traditional neon world, and that's two electrodes. They're illuminated with what we call a transformer, and the transformer converts the wall current, which traditional wall plug, you plug in your appliance or something like that, is 110 volts here in the U.S. Well, a transformer converts that voltage into anywhere from 4,000 volts to 15,000 volts is the largest transformer that is commercially available. And that's how you illuminate a traditional tube. And now it gets dicey when you go into the world of plasma. In the world of plasma, one of the easiest distinctions is rather than having two electrodes, we often have just one electrode. And that one electrode, from just description standpoint, we'll usually use a tubulated electrode. And the tubulation, again, is just a place for us to draw out the air with the vacuum pump and then backfill with the inert gas, and then have a small hand torch where we can seal it off when we have the illuminated effect that we want. So now, like I said, with traditional neon, you have these two electrodes. Well, with plasma neon, you usually have either one electrode, or even in some cases, you'll have just a volume that you're going to have a tubulation on, no electrode, and you're going to illuminate it with a radio frequency field from the outside with no electrode at all. We refer to that as an external electrode. So we the plasma world, we do into external electrodes and internal electrodes. And then that electrode then just becomes a conductor for what we would use for illuminating plasma neon would be high frequency electricity rather than high voltage. We use a combination of high frequency and high voltage to excite the gases with a radio field. So it operates slightly different from the illumination standpoint in that we use a higher frequency electricity with high voltage and create sort of a radio field. I like to say that in plasma neon, the transformer is a radio transmitter, and the tube or the object is actually an antenna. And that's, once you kind of understand that, it helps to realize that just like an antenna sends out things into the airwaves, so does a plasma neon transformer. It sends energy out into the airwaves, so that anywhere within a certain proximity will have a lot of free ions to stimulate the gases inside of the volume. It's hard if you're not familiar with traditional neon to get your head around some of these concepts.
Mm-hmm.
But really, we're trying to create volumes that we then evacuate and then backfill with gases, and then we use sort of tricks of electronics to create these high-frequency radio fields to illuminate the objects with. And that's how we sort of define traditional neon versus plasma neon, is this single electrode and the high-frequency power supply that we would use to illuminate a plasma object.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, with plasma objects, you also get the kind of tactile sense, if anyone's familiar with the plasma globes. Actually, I met one person who has never ever seen a plasma globe before. And that was kind of interesting.
No, I can understand that. It's actually a phenomenon that's not as commonly experienced by people. And of course, it's different into how it's been filled and what it looks like to elicit different experiences.
Mm-hmm.
So maybe if I could respond to some of your questions, it might be helpful, if things that you know that perplex people about the distinction between the two processes along with our discussion.
Mm-hmm. So a lot of these questions that I get, where they come from, how does it light up, and maybe you could talk about, I guess, another, like, speaking about the process of these gases, these inert gases, become illuminated through these high-frequency radio waves or the high voltage.
Well, what you're really doing, in a sense, and now imagine the gases that we're talking about, these are basic elements, and you'll see that on the periodic table of elements that all of these gases fall in one line: neon, helium, argon, and we refer to these as the noble gases. Xenon would be one of them. Krypton would be another noble gas. And so we're talking about as pure a form of these gases as possible. And that's part of it, is that all of these gases come from air. Air is a combination of all of these different gases at different densities, or different proportions of air. Air, most people aren't aware of, is actually mostly nitrogen, or is a high percentage of nitrogen, which is one of our gases. It's made up of, obviously, oxygen, and I could go down the list of the compositions of air, but mostly these inert gases are within that air plus O2, or O, and oxygen. And so what we've done is, back in the early 20th century, Georges Claude, he was basically a scientist in France, and he found a way to distill these airs. So in a sense, he would take air and he would compress it into a liquid. And once you take air and you compress it into a liquid, then you can determine that these gases will vaporize into a vapor at different boiling points. And so he'll condense these gases, and then through a very careful control of temperature, you can actually boil off the different gases at different points. And then you can suck them off, let's call it, take the vapor away and isolate that vapor and do a process of distilling. So you're taking this compressed air, and then you're slowly heating it up and vaporizing different gases at different temperatures. And of course, because air is made up of different percentages of these gases, you're only going to get a certain volume from the amount of gas that you would distill. And so that has a lot to do with the cost of these various gases. Xenon gas is probably the most expensive gas because it's also the rarest gas. It's the smallest percentage of air. And so, of course, it's really a measure of energy, because it takes a lot of energy to compress and then boil off these various gases, or distill off these various gases. And so xenon, because it's only, I think it's like 1,000th of 1% of air, that's a lot of compressing to get a small amount of xenon. And then some of the gases, they're actually naturally forming. In the case of helium gas, the helium can be formed and adjacent to the production of radon. So a lot of the helium, rather than to distill it, they actually find places where there's natural deposits of helium, and then they draw off the helium in a higher purity, or I should say a higher density, and then start to purify it from there. But that's really the only gas that is commonly available as a byproduct of the radon that's found in nature. Otherwise, most of these gases, as a practical matter, are distilled from air. And so I tell people that they're non-toxic because obviously they're what we breathe, and they're, obviously you could suffocate if you breathe, just solid xenon or something like that. They always say that there's a danger of suffocation when you're dealing with large volumes of gas because it looks like air, but your body can't process it. So that's really how all these gases in a simple way are distilled from air. And they're most of the cost of them is associated with the expense of condensing it from air, heating up, and the process of distilling the gases from air. And so the gases that we mostly use are 99.9% pure. So that is, we're trying to evacuate our tubes or our blown glass objects as purely as possible to then backfill these pure gases into these environments. And then these electrical tricks that we use, what they do is they really stimulate the behavior of the gas. This is what I always try to tell people, is that when you mix these gases or you use these gases in combination or as individuals at different pressures, you're really just bringing out a different behavior in the gas. So we've studied and expect certain kinds of behaviors out of these gases, and so that we know that with pure neon, and we put a strong energy source to it as in the form of traditional neon, the behavior of the gas is going to glow bright red. That's a behavior of the gas. And so that's what I try to get people to understand, is that these are how the gases behave inside of these radio fields, or in the case of traditional neon, with high voltage electricity streaming through it. And so the behavior of the gas is suddenly red, or suddenly blue, or bluish green, or whatever the different gas might be that is being illuminated. A lot of people don't realize that you can illuminate air. When you do traditional neon, through the processing and you use high voltage, you actually can light up air. But air is a very poor conductor of electricity. So when you light this air up, a byproduct of lighting it up is heat. And we use that in traditional neon to heat up the tube by heating up or illuminating air that is a poor conductor of electricity. So that's one of the other tricks of neon, traditional neon, is that we actually we control the vacuum to use the heat that air would create when you put a lot of electricity to it.
Okay, that explains a lot. I was reading through that process earlier today, and I was wondering why they would backfill with air, but now it makes sense in that so-called bombarding process or cleaning process.
Yeah, if you imagine you have a tube that's hooked up to a vacuum pump, and I tell people that it takes 10,000 volts to jump just 1 inch of air. If I were to make a Jacob's ladder and I put out a transformer with 2 wires coming very close together, and they may make an arc between those two terminals. If you see an arc that's 1 inch long, that represents 10,000 volts. And so so imagine you've got a tube, you've got an electrode at each end. That's in a sense a type of a Jacob's ladder situation with 2 wires. And then, of course, that tube might be 10 feet long. So we could calculate out that might take 300,000 volts to jump the length of that tube. So now if I start drawing out the air, I'm starting to what we would call lower the resistance of the tube from electrode to electrode. So slowly, as I start to suck out air, that electricity that would only jump 1 inch for 10,000 volts, suddenly 10,000 volts will jump a foot.
Unfortunately, this is where the recording stopped. I noted at the beginning of the podcast I was going to give you guys a little something extra, and that is a clip from a conversation I had with Pat back in June. I asked about what he's interested in regarding plasma, whether it's the lighting effects, which could include the way the light moves inside the form, or including color combinations, or it's the form, and that's relating to the creating a dynamic interior for the light. And I do plan on talking about this in another podcast very soon, so stay tuned for that. I hope you guys enjoy.
Do you find it more exciting to kind of play around with your phosphor applications, or to allow form and a light mixture to be, the effect?
You mean in the sense of, what do you mean?
In the sense of filling a plasma, or even.
Well, that's what I think. I think I'm getting away from myself, getting away from the effect of the light being important. I mean, in the sense, like I said, for myself, I'm starting to feel like it's the form and the surface that interest me the most. I mean, in the sense of what I can explore. Because obviously, to me, there's a limitation to the number of kind of effects I can derive. And now it starts to feel less important to me. So that's why I feel like if I have a palette of 5 kinds of fills, then I have an infinite palette of form and shape and combinations and stuff that I fill with. And what I've learned is that certain shapes prefer different fills, and they prefer, like if you're using an electrode or if you're doing it wireless, those are the variables, less the fills. You know what I mean? I think you find yourself finding, the fills, you just kind of develop a palette of them.
Right.
And now to me, the exciting part is, what am I going to blow? What's the interior going to look like? What is how I'm going to mount it? How am I going to install it? Why am I making these things? That's
the hard one.
Those are the more perplexing questions. I'll probably fill it with neon and helium. Or I like the fill. This one seems like it's going to be a fill where I'll make the racy xenon fill. This one would be a really great one if I did a lazy xenon fill. This one would be a really great one if I did that. But, like I said, for me, it's the 5 or 7 fills. Then it's really the shape and the form that really gets me probably the most interested.
Yeah, I'm pretty excited about what I'll probably make this year, especially with the neon and plasma becoming more available to me.
Absolutely.
And trying to see if I can really absorb this into my work.
I know I like your attitude, because I think that's honestly, I do so much more than plasma, in a sense of my interest as an artist. That's just like one part of my interest as an artist. So many other things interest me as well. And I think that I'm not sure if I really found my voice with plasma yet. I think going to Sweden was probably as close as I felt to really feeling like I was interested in what I was expressing with plasma. Before that, I've been kind of like, oh yeah, it fascinates me. I have enough background in it. All these other things kind of feed themselves, but I don't really feel like I found a voice until the work I did more recently in Sweden. And I think that, to me, that's part of it, is that I speak so much in other art forms. I express myself in so many other forms of art that plasma is just kind of part of that palette. And I'm not even sure if it's the most important part. But right now I still, I'm enjoying, having the ability to work this way, and that people are getting more interested in it.
Mm-hmm.
It's nice to have a community of people. I think it's just going to get better. I mean, I know, because I'm obviously on the, kind of the executive committee for the Plasma Art Alliance, and we're just feeling like we're coming to organize. I mean, I feel like so much more is going to happen in the next 6 months. And we'll be planning a conference, I assume, in the very near future.
That could be fun.
Yeah, I'm really excited. I know that, and the Neon Museum has really kind of opened themselves up to being kind of a pivotal resource. Because I think that's what we needed, was really a kind of a sponsoring institution. And I think right now they seem like a good match, and they seem like they're ready to be that sponsoring group to help us kind of get on our legs and have a place to stage another exhibition. Maybe we'll probably likely that we'd have our next conference in LA, stuff like that, and we'll start to grow the membership and give people an opportunity to participate more.
Yeah.
But I'm excited. That's going to be pretty fun.
Thank you for listening to the first episode of Taming Lightning. We have many more guests to come, and some returning to expand on questions and practices of a variety of subjects. I'd like to thank Pittsburgh Glass Center for supporting me, as well as encouraging me to pursue this project. We've only just begun, but we've already gathered interest in hosting instructors for next summer's classes. That means plasma and possibly traditional neon classes will be available to us. Individuals like Wayne Stratman, Jacob Fishman, Sally Prash, Mundy Hepburn, and many more have emailed and contacted me showing interest in teaching a class here. So I'm working really hard to get everything set up and ready to get things ready for a class setting. I also like to thank Pat Collentine for his time and his mentorship. Many of our discussions have helped me in life, in art, as well as this project itself. I also like to thank the Plasma Art Alliance, because without them, I probably would not have this project. It's through the Plasma Art Alliance that a lot of different individuals, through a recent show at the Museum of Neon Art, that I've been able to make this huge contact. So we have a lot of people to go through that are interested, and I think those individuals in that group also like to hear more about the subjects and more about the artists working in this process. If you'd like to support this, just simply go to my website, percyeccles.com, click on the tab that says Taming Lightning, and then click subscribe. Later, there'll probably be other options to help me out, but right now, all I need is you to like, share, and subscribe. So, thank you again for listening. See you next time.